think there's still a few people trying to sign on, but I think we can go ahead and get started with the administrative slides and everything. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to CEO Sponsor, community and guests to our webinar on analytics for driving high performance with Alec Levenson. I'm going to go through just a couple of administrative slides before I turn it over to Alec. So all your lines will be muted. If you want to speak during the discussion, you can click the raise hand button over there on your right. If you have a question, though, that comes to mind during the presentation, feel free to type it in the chat box. Try to send it to everyone, but if you forget, that's okay. I'll copy it and paste it and send it back out to everyone so that everyone can see your question. So we are recording this webinar, and you will receive a PDF of the slide deck and the recording via email probably tomorrow afternoon. You should expect to get that. The webinar today aligns closely with Alec's Strategic Analytics seminar here in Los Angeles in May. This year it's hosted by Capital Group. Before I turn it over to Alec, I just want to introduce him to you, and you can see some of his focuses up there, including analytics, and then his latest book, Strategic Analytics, which aligns really well with this webinar and the seminar in May, and his new really interesting book, What Millennials Want from Work. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alec. Alec, in just a minute, you'll have control.
Thank you, Carrie. And welcome everyone who's on and who is getting on. I would say, I guess, good morning, good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in, or maybe even part of the world. Let me see, I got the slides here. Okay, I'm trying to advance, let me see. Okay, Carrie, for some reason, I'm not able to advance the slides.
Okay,
oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. Great, okay. All right, so as Carrie mentioned, what we're going to talk about today is closely aligned with two things. One is the program that I have in May, which I'll give another little plug for at the end. And then secondly is my new book, which is called Strategic Analytics. And what I'm going to be presenting is one of the themes and one of the focuses that I talk about in the book. The book really comes from many, many years of work done by myself and my colleagues and those that came before me at the center. I really feel like I'm kind of standing on the shoulders of many people here. There is the approach that I take in the book is to look at what is, if you think about kind of organization diagnostics, where is it that we need to be focusing our attention to be able to understand what are the kind of the true barriers to achieving breakthrough performance and the barriers that get in the way of being able to really execute against the strategy. And that's the focus of the book. We do have a 2-day program, so if it feels a little bit like this is sipping from a fire hose, I apologize, but this in 1 hour I can just give you a little bit of a taste and then invite you to engage more, whether it's through the book or through our sessions or other ways that you can work with us at the center. Okay, so the topic for today I want to talk about is high performance and really around how you can understand what you need to be doing to be able to enable high performance in your organization. And there's kind of two that are kind of equal sides of this, equally important. One is the design side and the other is the diagnosis side. And so, the headline that I kind of brought you all in on is around the analytics, but you need to talk first of all about kind of what are the design objectives you're trying to accomplish. And from there, that'll tell you what you need to be looking at in terms of the analysis and understanding where things need to improve. Okay. So, and to start, I want to go to compensation. This is something that, some of you are probably rolling your eyes and others are probably saying, absolutely, it's one of the hardest things to do. It's inevitable. And this is what I find over and over again is that when I'm going and working with organizations, when my colleagues do, when you yourselves are working with your stakeholders, there is always this huge kind of sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, which is around what is the amount that the organization is actually willing to pay for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And this, it always comes down to this, right? And part of the challenge is that when senior leaders go through the annual budgeting process, so they take a look at what the results have been, where you're trying to go with your strategy, and then decide how much they want to be spending on, all the different parts of the organization. there are very strong assumptions that get built into those decisions around what are the actual capabilities you can accomplish with that spending and what is the kind of productivity you're going to get out. And the problem that we have, particularly, all of us working over on the receiving end of this, in org effectiveness and in HR and in OB, the problem that we have is that they kind of create these facts on the ground where we then have to respond and say, okay, well, you've told us that you're only willing to spend so much on, all these different activities, and then, we're supposed to be responsible for getting the performance out. And part of the goal that I have with this diagnostic approach is to say that if you're trying to design the right solutions, you need to understand kind of how you've got to let's say we're talking about like a card game here, okay? So you have a hand that's been dealt to you in the card game, and that hand is going to very strongly shape what it is you can actually do in terms of the kind of performance you can achieve. And from a diagnostic standpoint, in terms of analytics, you want to be looking at the whole card game. Okay, what is it, what kind of hands were dealt, what are you sitting with, what are your opponents sitting with, so you can understand where it is that you can, kind of where you can play to your strengths and where it is that you have to be able to shore up the weaknesses. And so the kinds of questions that we often aren't asked to address, but which are important to understand from a diagnostic perspective, are the kinds that are sitting on this slide. Okay, so, and it really gets down to how much is it that we are willing to pay for a job, and what kind of productivity can you expect to get out for that, and then and then how does that all come together to help support the strategy? So to give you some concrete examples, the kinds of, when I'm approaching this work, the kinds of things that I like to do, particularly when I'm working with companies and we're working together to try to understand where the barriers to performance are, is to ask things like, well, you've got your current state. You've got the, how much you're spending now. You've got the, the competencies that you're trying to recruit for, train for, give people, give them rewards for being able to improve, promotions, the whole 9 yards. Okay. And the question you want to ask yourself as you look across the different parts of the organization is, what would be the benefit of investing in greater capability? And on the flip side, we never like to talk about it this way, but if we have to save money somewhere, okay, because there is, in some sense, we've got a zero-sum game here, right? We only have so much money we can spend, and we have to make sure we're spending the right ways. So if we want to make an argument that we need to be investing more in some capabilities, paying more for a job, increasing the compensation or increasing what kinds of, developmental opportunities we give people, and we have to spend time and money on that, okay. So everything comes at a cost, and one of the costs is saying, well, where is it that we might be able to economize? Okay, so if we're increasing in one area, where is it that we won't increase or maybe even cut back without necessarily significantly hurting our performance? Okay. And so you need to ask yourselves kind of what is the benefit of what you're trying to accomplish. So to make this real and to think about this in kind of in people terms, which is the way that we always do, let's think about like employee engagement and think about people engaging with customers. So we have this model that's been out there for a long time, which is the customer service profit chain. The original model, the original work on this comes from Sears, but we don't like to talk about Sears anymore since they've been struggling on the retail side. But the modern day equivalent of Sears would be Nordstrom's, right? So the story goes that if you have more highly engaged employees, if you invest in them, if you make sure that they want to come to work, that they give you your all, so you give them the right feedback, you give them the right rewards, you compensate them well enough. If you do that, that'll help to drive sales. And in an environment like Nordstrom's, that's absolutely the case. Okay, for those of you who have shopped there, and for those of you who haven't, they really excel at being able to get people to buy more. So one of the challenges is to make sure you don't walk in the door, because once you do, you're probably going to walk out spending more than you wanted. And one of the ways they do this is, for example, by let's say you go and you find some clothes you want to try on, you go into the dressing room, and then the salesperson will come back repeatedly with more and more items that are, like what you're looking for, whether it's a shirt or a pair of pants or an outfit. And they're really excellent at being able to, bring you more things, which lead to you buying more. Now, that's only going to happen though if the salespeople are engaged and want to be doing their jobs well. If they're not happy, if they're detached from the job, if they're not willing to want to give you their discretionary effort, then they're not going to give you the customer service that you're expecting, and Nordstrom's is going to get its sales. So there is a very tight link between employee engagement and customer sales in Nordstrom's. So definitely the kind of thing you want to invest in would be the processes, the compensation, the training that enables people to be highly engaged in Nordstrom's. The flip side of that is a store like 7-Eleven, and there actually was a case where 7-Eleven actually tried this before. So they had read about all of the benefits of doing employee engagement, and they thought, well, we can do the same thing and we can help our sales. Well, to make a long story short, it didn't, and if anything, it went the opposite direction, and that's because when people go to 7-Eleven, they're going there because they want to get in and out quickly. They're not going there to have a long conversation with a barista like at Starbucks. All right, so we pay extra premium prices at Starbucks partly for the quality of the drink, but also because it's the experience. It's able to go in, make you feel special. And 7-Eleven, their value proposition is very different. So when 7-Eleven tried to invest more in employee engagement, trying to get to higher performance through spending their money on getting people to interact with the customer, what they found was the exact opposite happened. So that's not what the customer expects in an environment. And if anything, when you start to try to engage in more chit-chat, have a longer conversation with people at the checkout line at 7-Eleven, you then slow things down so the line can build up and people will actually walk out the door. So it actually hurt their sales. And this is an example, I like to use this one because, everybody likes to talk about, how important employee engagement is. And as my colleague Teresa Welburn would say, you have to ask engaged in what, right? And are we getting them engaged in doing activities and behaviors that are aligned with what we need to accomplish with the strategy, or are we not aligned? And that's what this ultimately comes down to. We're talking about high performance, and so we achieve high performance. It's partly through discretionary effort on the part of employees, but also in large part through how the work is designed and how well aligned the different parts of the system are. And when you have things well aligned, then you can have high performance, and when they're not, then you can suffer. Okay, so to kind of make this a little bit clear in terms of the stark choices here, when it comes to the decisions that are made at the C-suite level, like what businesses do we want to be in? Are we trying to be a high-quality, high customer service approach because we want to be able to sell at higher margins, we want to be able to have greater customer retention, or are we going to go for like a lower quality, lower margin, but maybe higher volume? We're making a lot more, in terms of pennies as opposed to dollars with each transaction. And those are strategic decisions. Those are the ones that are made at the C-suite level, and once those are made, then there are very specific ways we have to design the organization. There are ways we have to do compensation, the way that we do performance management. It flows all the way through, and it all has to be aligned from an organization design standpoint. And so the way I like to call it is, so on the one hand, we're choosing between high performance, and I'm going to call the other one, and instead of calling low performance, because no one ever wants low performance, I call it execution. Right? So the choices, if you want to think about it, when you're looking at the current organization design that you have, you're right in the middle of this slide here. Okay? So wherever you are in terms of what are your margins, who are the competitors that you're working with, kind of how much agility do you have in your organization, the question about do we want to be achieving higher performance is saying from a strategy standpoint, from an organization-wide standpoint, do we want to be going for higher margin business where we've got fewer competitors and greater agility? Now, anybody might say, well, of course that's what we want to do, but you can't just snap your fingers and say, we're going to be able to accomplish that. You have to design the organization the right way, and you have to be able to execute at that level. Okay. So the alternative would be to say, maybe we can actually get by with going down to a kind of a lower performance objective, which is around, say, lower margins. You're out there, you're fighting for things much more with a lot more competitors, and in that kind of a setting, you're focusing less on organizational agility and more on execution, on being really good at executing and being able to save down to the penny. And there is no crystal clear answer that you should either be going, staying where you are, or going for improving along the performance spectrum, or going down for, more fighting it out. These are the kinds of decisions that are made, at the C-suite level. When we bring that down to the level of individual jobs and roles and individual workers, there's the same kinds of scenarios that get played out. Okay, so there is the job as it's currently designed, which puts us right in the center of the slide, where you've got whatever their current roles and responsibilities are, the degree of decision-making autonomy they have, how they fit into the overall workflow. And then you can decide, do we want to be going for a higher performance design or a lower performance design? And this is where the whole discussion of engagement becomes really important. Okay. So when we talk about wanting to leverage employee engagement, we talk about wanting to get people's discretionary effort involved, that only works from a strategy standpoint. That only works if we want people to have more autonomy. If by giving them more autonomy, they have the ability to be able to deliver more, but that depends on what the actual product and service is that we're trying to provide. Okay, so think back again to the Nordstroms, versus the 7-Eleven example, or you can think about like like a case of McDonald's. So in McDonald's, you have a very highly designed system that gives very little discretion to employees, and in fact, you need to hire people in and have them with an expectation that they're not going to be changing the system, because all of the benefits, the whole system is set up so that you will get high performance through people not deviating, through being as consistent as possible and executing exactly what you tell them to do. Okay, so that is on the kind of the lower part of the slide, which is you're giving people less responsibility, less autonomy. They really have to focus on being really good at doing things routinely, and that is how they make money at McDonald's. Okay, the flip side would be like a high-end restaurant, where it's a very specialized service, where you've got, wait staff that is incredibly important for creating the ambiance and creating the customer experience, and can make all the difference in the world in what people buy. Okay, so we have McDonald's versus the 5-star Michelin, 4-star Michelin restaurant. That's the kind of difference that we're talking about in this slide here. Once we've got the work design options laid out, you then want to look at where is it that compensation fits along this path. Now, when we think about the kinds of arguments people make around, how much should be spent on the different roles in the organization, and I know that, probably everybody in this call has been through this kind of conversation at least a few times in your career, if not a few times in the last 2 weeks. So you're talking to one of your line executives, and they're making the argument for why their people should be paid more, right? And everybody always makes this argument. Well, the answer is, you might be able to benefit by having the people in your work group paid more, but that might not be the right thing for the organization overall. And you need to be asking the question of where is it that we're designing for high performance in the system, and where is it we're designing more for execution? And we have to have compensation aligned with it. Okay. So where we want to be is on the kind of the upper right or the lower left quadrants, in this little 2x2. So if we have a high-performance work design where we want people to be focusing on higher quality, higher margins, greater customer service, then we are expecting a lot of them, which means we need to have them performing at a higher level. They need to have greater levels of greater competencies, and to do that, we have to pay them accordingly. The flip side, so that's the 4-star Michelin restaurant would be the upper right. The flip side would be like the lower left would be McDonald's, and we're paying people less. We've got more of a tight work design, less autonomy, and whether it is the 4-star restaurant or the McDonald's, as long as compensation is aligned with the work design, then everything's fine. The problems come when you get into the off diagonals. Okay, so you've got so in the lower right, that's a situation where you've got an organization where you really don't need people to have a lot of discretion in decision making. You're not letting them go off and try to reinvent things, be agile on their own. You just want them to follow the process. And in that kind of a setting, for the most part, you don't want to overpay relative to the market. You probably want to be paying, right around, the 50th percentile or, maybe even less than that, and you can still get high performance. Well, but then you've got individual managers who rightly say, well, I can perform my objectives. I can meet my objectives as a manager if you let me get better quality people in here, if you let me pay more for them. And they're right, but from a strategy standpoint, that's not where you want to be spending your money. So you get out of alignment when when you've got the kind of an execution work design, but you're paying as if it was a high performance work design. And then the flip side is when you're in the upper left. And that's a situation we get into a lot when, the problem with having a system that works really well and getting everything aligned and everybody working really well together is that then the demands of meeting Wall Street's numbers come in, and there always is a tendency. I mean, I don't care what organization you're in, you could be designed extremely well, everybody can be working, all in complete harmony. You've got this, well-tuned, high-functioning team. And inevitably, there's going to be, someone who's going to come in, a senior executive or, someone in the middle ranks who will say, you know what, we can do this and we can just do it for a little bit cheaper. Okay? And we can shave a little bit of pennies off and we can still be just as good. And you know what, they're right. If you go from, instead of people giving people a 3% raise, you give them only a 2.8% raise, no one's going to notice that difference for 1 year. But if you let that go on over and over and over again, and there's a classic case of this that I write about in the book. It's also available as an article. We saw a similar experience like that when we were doing some work with Frito-Lay a number of years back, and they gave control over the labor budget to their regional vice presidents, and they made the decision that in order to meet their numbers, they could kind of shave off how much they were paying their workers, and it kind of worked for a little while, but then over time, they eventually got to the point where there were huge gaps between how much they were paying relative to even what their own comp model said. And they very much had a high-performance work design because they get a lot of their competitive advantage from the people who bring the products into the stores, and they were cutting back on how much they were paying them. So they were putting themselves in the upper left quadrant here, and it led to all kinds of problems. I mean, they were essentially coming back to paying where the market was, but it was not what they needed in order to succeed with the strategy. And it ended up, ended up hurting them, like, cutting off their nose to spite their face. So these are real pressures, and we face them all the time. From a diagnostic standpoint, you need to be able to take a step back and say, where is it that we actually are trying to be in terms of the work design, in terms of how the compensation lines up against that, and that will tell you, that will go a long ways towards figuring out where is it that you need to be changing how you're spending, how the organization's been designed, so you can actually improve how you're executing against the strategy. So I want to go through a couple of examples now to kind of bring this to light. Let's talk about pharmaceuticals for one. Okay, so within pharmaceuticals, the strategy is very clear, particularly for branded pharmaceuticals. So we're talking here about the GlaxoSmithKlines, the Pfizers, all the big companies that we know. All right, so their strategy is to develop and to sell high-margin drugs, and their source of competitive advantage comes from R&D, from sales, and from mergers and acquisitions. Okay, now the organizational capabilities you need to support that are innovation, market share, and your ability to be able to evaluate. It's innovation to capability. It's the capability to acquire and maintain market share, and doing that through sales and also through mergers and acquisitions. Okay, so those are the organizational capabilities. When we look at the individuals, we talk about their individual competencies, like the scientific competencies, sales competencies. But from a diagnostic standpoint, it's really important to keep those two different things in mind. Okay, so innovation requires that you have people who are good in technical or scientific competencies, but just hiring the best people who are, the most technically proficient, whether it's the best software programmers or, researchers for pharmaceuticals, engineers, hiring the best people, as we know, does not guarantee that you're going to get the innovation. Okay? The innovation happens through designing the organization the right way, getting the work processes, and having it all come together. Same thing when it comes to sales. Okay? We can hire really good salespeople, but what are the systems that we have in place that enable us to identify who are the targets we're going after? What are the customer teams that they're putting together so that we're getting the right sales with our, with our largest customers, and getting the right products coming through the supply chain. So the organizational capabilities we need to support are broader and represent the entire work system design, and not just the competencies of the individual. And so when we come at this from a diagnostic standpoint, you want to be looking at that at both levels. You have to say, what is it we're trying to accomplish at the organizational level in terms of the capability? What is it we need in terms of individual competencies? And how do all of those come together? And we want to look at that, whether it's using like a STAR model, like Jay Galbraith's STAR model, or whatever your preferred model is for organization design and diagnostics. You want to make sure you're touching all parts of it so that you can do the full diagnostic. And then I've got the point, and then the final points at the bottom of the slide here around compensation is, we want to be, in terms of the zero-sum game, you want to be asking yourself the questions of, we have certain capabilities that we're trying to, that enable us to build and maintain our competitive advantage. If we were to spend more on those capabilities that directly support our competitive advantage, like in branded pharmaceuticals, it's around R&D and sales and mergers and acquisitions. If we invested more in those capabilities, how much more lift would that give us in terms of executing the strategy? And similarly, if we were to, say, cut back a little bit in other parts of the organization, so in pharmaceuticals, if we cut back in IT, if we cut back in HR, if we cut back in other parts that are important but not critical for executing the strategy, could we invest those dollars in other places so that we could actually get to better strategy execution? That's the kind of question you want to ask. And the main point is that when you talk about high performance, we want to be applying the high performance work design principles in some parts of the organization, but not all of them. Okay? And it needs to be focused on the areas of competitive advantage. And everywhere else, you want to take more of an execution-focused approach. So what do I mean by that? Here it is kind of shown for a number of different industries. Now, these are high-level generalizations. This is not a step-by-step way of understanding specifically for any one company in these industries, but as a generalization, it helps to kind of helps you to see where there are the areas we want to be investing in high performance versus not. Okay, so in the first column, we've got the branded pharmaceuticals, and what I've shown there is that you've got, whether it's an R&D, branding and marketing, and in operations, you definitely want to be high performance. So in quality and operations, you need to be high performance, because in pharmaceuticals, if you don't, then people can get sick or die. So that needs to be designed for high performance. Similar thing in terms of government relations. Okay, when it comes to distribution and customer service, though, they don't need to be designing those parts of the branded pharmaceutical companies for high performance, because that's not where they get their competitive advantage. That's not where they make their money. Okay, if your local pharmacy is temporarily out of the prescription you're trying to fill, as long as they can get it in by the next day, it's not such a big deal. Okay, they are not going to lose your sale. Similarly, there is the customer service. I mean, if there is a product recall, if there's a significant problem, then they have to think about customer service, but it's not how they actually drive their products into the market. Okay, if we go 2 columns over into the middle under food or consumer products, they're almost the polar opposite of the branded pharmaceuticals. So they get their competitive advantage a lot through distribution, through having really robust, large go-to-market systems. So there's a reason why there are only about 6 food companies in the entire world, national and international food companies, and that's because in that industry, the competitive advantage is driven almost exclusively through the strength of your distribution network. Okay, so being in every single retail store, every single grocery store, all the different convenience stores, and being able to push product out, across an entire country. and also or even an entire continent. And then having the branding to convince people why they should be buying your branded product as opposed to generic, ones that could be on the shelf right next to them. And they are literally almost the polar opposite of pharmaceuticals. So if you're in consumer products, R&D is useful, but for the most part, the R&D that takes place by the big consumer products companies is a lot of Me Too innovation, right? So they're figuring out what's a different flavor or a different kind of scent you want to put into a shampoo, or a different formulation to make the shampoo slightly better, or hand soap, or kind of think about all the different products. There's important innovation that takes place there, but the really breakthrough innovation almost always happens outside of the large major consumer products companies. It happens outside of PepsiCo, outside of Nestle, Unilever, Procter & Gamble. And so you have the people who are doing the innovating on the outside. They then create the products. They will oftentimes grow to be, sometimes even be like a regional player, like within a country, like in the northeast of the U.S. or the southwest. But they eventually hit up against the economics that says that, you know what, we can't actually replicate the huge successful, go-to-market systems of the large companies, and they'll sell out. Okay, so there are R&D functions within the large consumer products companies, but they really are not a source of competitive advantage. Same thing in terms of quality and operations. Obviously, you need to make sure the products you're producing are, they're not going to spoil. People are not going to get, salmonella from eating spoiled food. But the level of kind of investment that you need for quality of manufacturing of those consumer products versus what you need in pharmaceuticals is very different. In pharmaceuticals, because they're so sensitive and they're drugs, you have to have much greater controls and much more investment than you do in the consumer products companies. This is just a factual statement about kind of where they get their competitive advantage. So regardless of what industry you're in, you can do the same kind of an exercise and say, where is it, what parts of our operations are the ones where we get our competitive advantage and where we need to be designing for high performance. And you can do that across industries. You can also do that within industries. So for example, in technology, Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Oracle, once upon a time we used to talk about there being software companies and hardware companies. Now every single one of these companies is in both software and hardware to one extent or another. But even then, kind of where they get their competitive advantage is very different, right? In Apple, it's obviously where how they bring together engineering and design to be able to create these products that have the magical customer experience. They've got their closed, they've got their closed environments, and so they have to get all their products to work really well together. Google produces, it does have a manufacturing arm now, particularly since they bought Motorola and they're producing their own phones, but they get all of their money from search and from YouTube and from their main search engines. So even though both Apple and Google have software engineers and they both have hardware engineers, the roles that they play are very different in those different organizations. And so, the job descriptions may even look exactly the same, but their contribution to their competitive advantage is very different. So we can't even talk about there being kind of one way to approach how you design software engineering jobs and what kind of a role they play and how do you align them with the rest of the organization across each of these different companies. You can say the same thing for Boeing and Airbus on the one hand, where they're producing the huge jetliners versus Embraer, which produces more of the regional jets. Okay, similar kinds of engineering that you need, but it's a different kind of a product, and so you design yourself differently. Then particularly within companies where you've got lots of different kinds of business lines within them, you can get differences across the business units that are as stark as when you go across industries. So for Disney, you've got the theme parks, ESPN, and Pixar. Right? The theme parks, it's about the competitive advantage there. It's about the magical experience you're creating for the customer in the parks, which is very different from ESPN, which is about being able to kind of lock up the rights for sports programming that people can't see anywhere else. And in fact, one of the challenges that ESPN is having, which is then having ripple effects back onto Disney right now, is that they're getting a lot more competition from platforms that are able to show clips of sporting events where people don't necessarily have to log on in real time to see the events while they're being broadcast. So that's hurting them. And then, Pixar, which is very different, that's about being able to tell. So there's some similarities between Pixar and the theme parks, right? They're both trying to give you a magical experience. But for the theme parks, it's about what you get in person, whereas for Pixar, it's what they can do up on the screen. And the kinds of roles you need for that, the kinds of competencies and where your competitive advantage comes is very different across those different business units. We can tell the same kind of story for General Electric and financial services versus aircraft engines and refrigerators. In fact, I need to now update this slide since financial services is no longer part of GE. And I will just remind people that if you have questions, you can feel free to kind of put your hand up, and Carrie will help point them out. Let me just go a little more detailed, a little bit of a deeper dive around pharmaceuticals to help to prove the point. So even within pharmaceuticals, so before I was talking about branded pharmaceuticals, but there also are generic pharmaceutical companies. And if you look across the different parts of the operations here, generic pharmaceutical companies in many ways look a lot more like a food company, like a consumer product company, than they do a branded pharmaceutical company, at least in terms of where their competitive advantage comes from. So for them, they're making all of their money off of a higher volume, of lower priced products. So it's a lot more like the consumer product companies that are, selling lots of bags of chips or, boxes of cereal. And where your competitive advantage comes from differs whether you're branded pharmaceutical or generic, and then that has direct implications for what are the roles within the organization that are more important for accomplishing the strategy and for being, and for having improved organizational effectiveness.
Alec, you do have one question in the chat box from Steve. And he's asking, so are you essentially saying pay up, i.e. above market median for critical jobs and fund that by paying down for less critical jobs?
So, Steve, as a principle, that's the right thing you want to think about. But the problem that we have, and this is, I run into this all the time when we're in helping organizations to understand kind of, where things are going on, whether or not, is that as a principle that makes sense. But in practice, it's not just about the pay for the job. It's about how that job fits into the whole system. Okay, so if you have a critical job, you may get a benefit by paying above market median, but you need to make sure you're also giving them the autonomy to making the right decisions, to be able to to give them the feedback they need. They need to have the appropriate training, the ability to be able to advance in their careers. So you have to design the whole system around that higher paying job the right way. In the same way, you have to design the whole system around a lower paying job the right way as well. Okay, so the idea, for example, that training can just decide, oh, we have to go out there and figure out what people need to be trained on, and we'll just go do it. Well, it may mean that there's certain parts of the organization where training is much more critical for getting the whole system to work well together, and where training is the barrier to getting the right performance. In other cases where people could be helped by getting trained, but it's not really the thing that's stopping you from being able to execute better against the strategy. So hopefully that helped answer the questions, but let me now move on. Okay. So from a diagnostic standpoint, the kinds of questions that you want to be asking yourself are, this is kind of a summary of kind of top to bottom what you want to be doing. So what are the kinds of products and services that we're producing and how we're delivering them? What is the actual strategy? And remember that a strategy is not we're going to grow our sales by X%. Okay. The strategy is how is it that you uniquely create value so that you have competitive advantage over the other companies that are out there in the industry. Okay. What is the actual work design, the organization design that supports the strategy? Okay. Where is it that things are aligned well with that? And then make sure that you're looking at the right level. Okay, so sometimes it's about looking at the whole organization. So if we're saying that we're not able to accomplish our results, well, sometimes that's about making sure you've got the right alignment across the different business units, or making sure that you've got people within the support functions that are working properly with operations, with the sales organization. And if that's the source of the problem, then you need to tackle it at that organization design level, at that level of where people are collaborating well across boundaries, and not necessarily drop down and say, well, what kind of training should we be giving people so they can be better performers. Okay. The level of analysis was really critical. So first to figure out where the barriers are, and then to go and to tackle it at the right level. Okay. And then within all of this, you want to be asking, have we actually properly defined roles and responsibilities so that people know what their expectations are, so that they're able to actually accomplish the performance we want from them? And if we haven't properly set out what the roles and responsibilities are, then you want to be looking at, how can we be addressing that work design better? Now, you may not be given permission to go in to change the work design, but as part of the diagnostic, you have to be asking the questions. Okay, this is something that I try to, I cannot emphasize this enough, but I find that I have to, even to myself as I go into work with an organization. Okay, so a company will come and they'll say, well, we want to, we want to figure out why this group of people, they're not motivated, right? Maybe we're not giving them the right kinds of encouragements and the right kind of, feedback information, and all that's great. Okay, but I will then go and even if I'm not given full permission, I will do a diagnostic around what are the roles and responsibilities, how has the work been designed, and have you potentially set people up for failure because you put them in an impossible situation. Because if that's the case, then trying to come in with some kind of a solution like, oh, well, we just need to change our recruiting profile, right? We got to get better people in here, get them, that are more capable. Or we've got to, engage them more, make them feel happy, give them, whether it's flexible working arrangements so that they'll feel, more comfortable with their work-life balance. Those kinds of things can be very important. But if there are fundamental problems with the way the work's been designed, a lot of that's a little bit like putting lipstick on a pig. The pig may look a little bit better, but you're not solving an underlying problem that's going to, turn it into a lovely swan. And so that has to be part of your diagnostic, even if you're not given permission to change the work design. Okay? But I'd much rather go back to a client, and say, hey, I know you want to be able to solve this. You want to be able to get it done in 3 weeks, but here are some deeper structural issues that you have to address first. And until and unless you do that, you're never going to get to the first best solution, right? You're always going to be sub-optimizing. And that's a much more mature conversation. I'd much rather have that than be telling people, the solutions that we're going to implement are going to solve all the problems for you. Now, I just want to make one side note about analytics versus statistics. And I find this is important because people will sometimes get wrapped around the axle around thinking, well, analytics is all about, what kinds of regression models we're going to run and, what kinds of high-powered statistics are we going to apply. And, I don't have that kind of training, so how can I do this? Well, the answer is that analytics, when it comes down to it, is about analyzing the situation in front of you. And particularly when you're talking about the work design, there is one work design that you're looking at, or you could be looking at multiple jobs, and there's a work design for each of those jobs, but there's no statistics you can apply for doing that. There's no regression analysis you can run. There's no ANOVA. There's no conjoint. The only thing you can do is you can say, what is the actual design we're trying to accomplish? What is the design that we have in place? And where are things aligned well and where aren't they? I mean, from a statistical standpoint, for those of you who maybe have had a stats class, the issue is that in order to do actual statistics, you have to have the exact same thing replicated multiple times. Okay, so if we're talking about sales teams, and these are sales teams that are deployed across the country, we've got like 300 of them working in different regions, we can actually talk about what is the sales team design and how well does that work in all the 300 different markets that we have. That's a reasonable question to ask. You could actually do some interesting statistics on that and probably even run some regressions. Okay. But let's say we're talking instead about customer teams that are serving your biggest customers, and you've got say 5 or 6 different industry groups that describe your different customers. Each one of those customer teams is going to be fairly unique because the requirements that they have for meeting the needs of the customers in each of those 5 different industries are likely going to be quite different. So you can describe generic competencies, and this happens a lot around managerial competencies. So we'll create these competency models that generically tell us, well, someone has to be good at doing customer interactions, or they have to be good at, being able to, handle the IT system, work with finance, all that. Okay, those are generic competencies, and they are important for performing in that role, but they don't actually tell you what leads to breakthrough performance when you're working with a particular customer. Okay, so there's a lot of information that those competency models just cannot capture that is important information we need to know about how well the individual is performing and how well the system is working, and you can't bring statistics to bear on that. So the good news here for those of you who aren't statistically inclined is that the deepest analytics here, particularly around work design and organization design, there's no statistics at all required. You just need the ability to be able to look objectively at, where things are aligned and where they're not. Okay. A couple more kind of comments around the kinds of questions you want to ask. It's really important to be able to look objectively at how you got to where you are in terms of the organization's history. There are a lot of decisions that get made that then create the situation that we're in today, and there's a lot of good intentions where people say, well, we're trying to meet these customer needs, we're trying to roll this new product, so we're going to do the best we can, and that's great, but doing the best you can is different from designing things optimally, and there's a lot of unintended consequences that happen from those kinds of decisions. So one of the most kind of glaring examples that we run into all the time is when you design a job for a person as opposed to for a kind of a broader talent pool. Okay? Anytime we have someone who is really unique, who brings a lot that we can't necessarily get anywhere else, we will design the job around that person, but that then creates enormous problems when we think about succession, like who's going to go into that role? Well, now we can't do it, so do you then start redesigning the entire organization because you can't do succession for that role? That's a bad way to approach job design and organization design. But those are the kinds of questions you want to be asking yourself as you're looking at your current state and saying, where is it that we made decisions in the past that we might have to go back and revisit in order to be able to get ourselves onto stronger footing and be more aligned and have better performance. And you can do that and you want to do that at all the levels, right? So you do that at the organization level, okay? So, where does the power lie in in operations versus in the support functions, okay? Are you a customer-focused organization? Are you more, are you more of a functionally aligned organization? Whatever it is, there are important decisions made about decision rights and power that then create the ability for you able to succeed well or not. Okay, those are the kinds of questions you want to ask at the organization level. You can then drop down and ask same kinds of questions at the team or the unit level. Okay, so why is it that they're staffed and resourced the way they are? Because those have very strong implications for performance. And then same thing, we get down to the individual role level. Okay. Just very briefly, I'm just going to go through this quickly because I want to make sure we get to the rest of the diagnostics message at the end for the last part of the presentation. But just a couple of comments about interdependencies. Okay, there are one of the key things that we often lose sight of when we're looking at individual jobs is that nobody is able to succeed operating entirely on their own, and there are very strong interdependencies between the different jobs that happen in the organization. Okay? And if you lose sight of those interdependencies, you can end up not spending enough in the places that need it the most. Okay. So examples for this. So if you think about, and I'm just going to go to the top of the slide, not the bottom part. We talk about the role-based view. Okay. When we're thinking about what kind of role people play in high performance, if you have a role of janitor, okay, in a typical office environment, a janitor is not part of a high-performance work design because even if it's in the C-suite, where we're talking about emptying out the CEO's wastebasket, if the janitor doesn't do his or her job right, for one day, it's not going to fundamentally impact the CEO's ability to be able to do her job. Okay. But if we think instead about a high-performance work design like memory chip manufacturing or CPU manufacturing, places at companies like Intel or AMD, Qualcomm, that are producing all these chips, they're operating in a clean room environment. In a clean room environment, the controlling dirt and dust is incredibly important, or your entire product line could be damaged. So, and even in that setting, they don't even necessarily call them janitors, but the people who are responsible for, the sanitation engineers or whatever title they give them, their role is critically important for making sure that the product doesn't get damaged. And so, you could even have a job description that's the same as a janitor, right? They have to keep things clean, they have to empty out the waste baskets, blah, blah, blah. But the expectations you have for performance in that role, how much you pay for it, what kinds of competencies you look for, what kinds of accountabilities, is very different in the clean room manufacturing environment versus in office support. Okay. Same kind of thing if you're talking about call center reps. If you're doing outbound telemarketing, trying to get people to buy credit cards, that's a very simple role. We can hire people in off the street. We can even have like 300% turnover and not have it impact our productivity. But if you take wealth management, people working for investment banks, for financial services companies, where you've got high net worth clients who are investing millions of dollars a year with you, the call center job in that setting, like we don't even call it a call center, but in many ways it is, right? We people who sit on the phone who help to hold the hands of our high net worth clients. That relationship is incredibly important. We want to have extremely low turnover. The knowledge base needed to succeed there is very deep. And so how that role fits into supporting high performance is very different in those different kinds of settings. Okay, now into our finale. When we talk about kind of optimizing organization design and work design, we want to know if things are working the right way. Okay, and I have to pause and give you a chance to read this cartoon. So I like this cartoon because, first of all, it makes me laugh, but secondly, it raises a very important point that when we're talking about what goes on within our organizations, there is a lot of times people get correlation and causation confused. Okay, so a very simple example of this is traffic jams, right? If you're too simple, if you kind of don't understand the way the world works, and you go out and you do observation, you might say, well, every time the sun comes up, there's a traffic jam, so therefore sunrises cause traffic jams, which of course is silly. We all know that that's not true, but we make other kinds of leaps that are within our organizations that are, where we think we're making the right decision, but in fact we're not, or at least the right diagnosis. So engagement is a perfect example. Okay, if you listen to Gallup, they'll tell you that you want to focus on employee engagement because that'll lead to better performance. They've actually got these fancy statistical models that supposedly prove it. We don't have time to get into that right now, but I'm here to tell you that the statistics actually don't support it. That in fact engagement and performance they're co-determined, meaning they tend to happen at the same time. And they tend to trend up together, but it's almost never the case that the engagement that we measure actually helps us predict where there's going to be problems in performance. Okay? And that's a fundamental challenge that we have when we talk about correlation versus causation. We need to be able to say, what is it that we have to change today in order to get to better performance tomorrow? And more often than not, it comes down to the actual work design. It's not how people are engaged. So people respond to the jobs, they respond to the incentives they're given, they respond to being able to be given stretch goals, to getting good feedback, to getting rewarded for doing their good job. When that happens, then they can be productive, and that can lead them to be, to have good job performance and have them be engaged, and that can feed on itself. So as our colleague, Ed Lawler has said, it's a virtuous spiral, but it also you can end up with a downward spiral as well if they're not all working together. So a lot of times we talk about things as causation when we're actually talking about things that get co-determined, and that's okay. We just have to recognize what it is we want to focus on. So, and the challenge that we have is that people tend to construct narratives about how things happen by starting with individual jobs and people, and that's great because we want to be able to get people, really engaged and think about what is the job's performance in the organization. So if we're a sales if sales are a key part of how we, drive our performance, then you talk about the great sales efforts. Same thing with innovation, supply chain, whatever it might be. But because of the interdependencies, it's not the case that we can just think about the individual. You need to think about actually how everything fits together. And the hard part from a diagnostic standpoint and in terms of improving performance is that not everything matters equally. Okay? There's so many things you can improve that if you start with where can we improve things, you can go out and you could spend months or years working on improving things that are not actually helping to address the barriers where you get the biggest gaps in your strategy execution. Okay, so you need to be building a causal model, and the causal model will actually tell you how you get from what's going on at the individual level, which I got here in the upper left, all the way down to the business results in the bottom right. And in between, which is, on the left side of the bottom of the slide here, I've got enterprise performance. So you've got everything that happens at the individual role level in the top left. And then that comes together where people are in your groups, or in your teams, in your business units, in your sites, and everybody there has to be doing their job well. That happens by having the right organization design, by building the right organization capability, and by having a culture that enables that to happen. And when all of that is aligned and working well, you can get the business results. This model here is one that I use a lot. If this doesn't work for you, then there's no one model to use, but you want to be, when you're doing your diagnostic, you want to make sure that you're looking at what are all the different factors that are coming into play at both the individual job level and then also at the group, or the unit level, and how that all comes together to give you the business results that you need. That's the diagnostic. And the book talks a lot about this, and this is also what I use for the workshop. When we talk about these stories about kind of things coming from the individual, so we tell the story about the salesperson, we tell the story about the person doing the great innovation, right? This is Steve Jobs and Apple. It's all about innovation. The story that we tell is starting from kind of the individual, the human capital level. We then, from there we build up to, well, this is how we got the business results, and that ultimately is what leads to us being able to execute the strategy. I mean, that's the great way to tell the story. But from a diagnostic standpoint, that's the absolute backwards way you want to run things. Okay? You never want to start with what are the diagnostics at the individual level. You actually want to start with where is it that we get our competitive advantage, what is it that's getting in the way of us doing that, and then you move on, to different parts. So this is kind of the final slide in terms of content I want to show you, and this is the step-by-step process that that I go through when I do this work, and that what I hope that I can get you to do as well when you're doing your diagnostic. So you always want to start with what is it that we're trying to accomplish in terms of the strategic capabilities that we're building? That's competitive advantage analytics. And one of the dirty little secrets here is that even on the business side, people get lost here and lose sight of the bigger picture, and they get focused on their particular part of the organization, right? Their particular part of the work process, whether it's in supply chain or operations or IT or what have you, and they lose sight of what the competitive advantages we're trying to build. And part of what you can do in terms of doing the diagnostics is to help them see, even on the business side, where things are going well and where they're not. And you need to do that both on the business side and on the people side, and that kind of integrated analytics will give you the complete diagnostic you need for the system. So you do it for, what is it we're trying to accomplish from competitive advantage. You then drop down to say, where is it the organization is structured well or not that enables us to get that. And then finally, if you need to, you can come down and do things at the individual level. So I will pause there, see if there are any other questions, and just here's a reminder of the session I have coming up in 2 months, and welcome you all to join us in Los Angeles if you can, I go through this in a lot of detail in a real step-by-step way with lots of examples. So any questions or comments?
I don't see anything in the chat box right now, but let's give it a minute in case someone's trying to type something and send it through.
So, and again, I apologize that this was a little bit like sipping from a fire hose, but as I said, the work that I do, I mean, I spend probably 70–80% of my time out working in organizations and helping them to do these kind of diagnostics. The book and the workshop is my way of being able to take this methodology that I use, that my colleagues at the center use, and to help you to be able to apply it, in the work that you're doing, every day. Well, if there are no comments or questions, then I will, definitely encourage you. For those of you who are part of our sponsor community, I also want to, thank you very much. Look forward to hopefully seeing some of you at our sponsors meeting in early May. And whether it's at my program or one of the other ones we have here, I look forward to having you engage with us further at the center.
I'm getting a lot of comments saying very clear and thank you, and it's informative. So I think you were so clear that no one has a question right now.
I think I just gave them a lot to chew on, and they need to go back and think about it.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and thank you so much, Alec, for a great webinar.
And thank you all.